hosted by the Deadline Club, which is the New York City chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. We'd like to thank our sponsors of this luncheon: CBS News, the Daily News, the New York Post, and Time Inc. Thank you, sponsors. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to introduce the honorees. Of course, our illustrious honorees have had careers of such distinction that they've been hired in the connections. Over the decades, their work has informed and enlightened us. They have shown readers and viewers behind the scenes in the boardrooms, the ballrooms, and the smoky back. And along the way, they've been champions of free speech and made our culture richer for it. So, we begin with Cindy Adams, whose gossip columns for the New York Post have been raising eyebrows for more than 30 years. She has contributed to television programs, including WNBC's Live at 5 and ABC's Good Morning America. Cindy has written 7 books, including biographies of acting teacher Lou Strasberg and the Kennedy Clan matriarch Rose Kennedy, and even a memoir of her dog Jazzy. She has been inducted into the New York Women in Communications Matrix Hall of Fame. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Cindy Adams.
Be able to get another hairdresser, forget it. Let me tell you, I'm really thrilled to get the award. I really am. It's very dear to me. Let me tell you exactly how dear it is. So far, the table cost me $1,800 and the Botox. They told me I was allowed to speak only about 2 minutes. 2 minutes. What do you know? I've had a career. I've been here since Lincoln. When he was assassinated, I had the story. So I'm supposed to do all this in 2 minutes. Nobody has given me 2 minutes since my wedding night. Okay, everybody sort of wants to know how you got with the New York Post. Mine was a story, it started in 1979. The Shah was in the hospital, he was dying. He was somebody I knew. Joey had done shows for the Shah. We saw him in Sadabad Palace in Tehran every year. Whenever he came here, I saw him. When he was dying, he sent for me to please come up to see him in the hospital. Understand, this was like if you were in the Bronco with OJ. Everybody wanted this. And I didn't think that was a laugh, actually. I thought it was serious. Everybody was ringing the place. I mean, there were, if a nurse had a bedpan 4 flights down, they were interviewing her. And here I was going up to see the Shah. I'd had dinner, I was supposed to have dinner that night with the then editor. And I called him and said, I can't because I'm seeing the Shah. And it was like a thud, and he thought I'm like retarded or something like that. What do you mean you're going to see the Shah? Well, I went to see him. He had a poster of a gorilla across the entire 2 rooms of the suite with fangs and saliva dripping from, and underneath it said, cheer up, things have to get better. I wrote that story with the help of everybody at the New York Post. It was an exclusive. It was world renowned. It went all over the world, and I never got paid for it. Jesse Angelo, the hotshot from the New York Post. I'm still mad from 30 years ago.
The check is in the mail,
You guys,
it's on its way.
You guys sent me some crappy flowers that look like soup creams. I'm only allowed 2 minutes, so I have to be very. Oh, before I had this column, I was on a weekly called Our Town. Joey was his first wife, and Walter Winchell were brothers. They were brothers, sisters-in-law. And so it meant a lot for him to have somebody who was a gossip columnist. He thought it was very important. So he pushed me into doing this. This was a weekly. I did a column for them once a week, and they paid me $5 a week, and not steady. And when I got the job on the Post, I went to him and I said, well, the Post, I want to do my extra 6th column or 7th column for the Our Town because they were so good to me. And the Post guy said, oh, well, you're crazy, but if you want to, go ahead. So I go tell the guy from Our Town, $5 a week and not steady, and he said, you can't work for 2 newspapers, you're fired. But anyway, this is my illustrious career. I'll tell you 1 or 2 quick stories and then I'm finished. I'm trying to think of some of the wonderful things that you would all, everybody thinks what we do is in some ways sort of glamorous. Let me tell you one story. Noriega, I had been interviewing him in Panama. I knew him. I'm very big with dictators. I gave a party once in Elder Marcos was there, Noriega was there. They said, if you're indicted, you're invited. So I knew Noriega, and when he went to jail, he sent for me, and he said, would you please, I need to speak to you. Now, you can't phone him. He's in prison. You have to wait for them to phone you. It took 6 months to get this conversation set. You have to go through the lawyer. Then he says he's going to call you at 10 minutes of 11. Well, I was there at 10 minutes of 11. He never called. Then the next time, 3 months later, he says, well, I'll make it at 20 after 4. I got there at 20 after 4, and he still didn't call. It took 6 months. Finally, the phone rings, and I'm there, and I pick up the phone. I'm sweating to get this exclusive. I'm so thrilled. He says, Cindy, it is the General. I said, oh, honey, I'm so glad to speak to you. What do you want to tell me? At that moment, Jazzy, my 4-pound Yorkie, walked on the buttons of the phone. I never spoke to him. Okay, do I have another 2 minutes? Marcos, another one of my great people. I know some nice people like at my table. Marcos, I was there with her when she was on trial every day. And there was a party. She wanted a party. I gave a party at my home. And it was her guest list. And it was all high-class people that I didn't know. And all of a sudden, in the middle of it, an ambassador from a South American country, his pocket started to ring. I said, why is your pocket ringing? He says, oh, I just meant to show this little alarm clock to my wife. It was my jeweled alarm clock from Cartier that he had palmed. So I just want to tell you, I know she's breathing down my neck, so I'm finished already. My career is over. I want to thank you all for having me. You owe me. You owe me.
Daily News, Newsday, and New York Magazine. For decades, journalism students have studied his ingenious 1963 article about John F. Kennedy's grave digger. A prolific author, Jimmy's books include The Game That Couldn't Shoot Straight and Ranch Ricky Alive. He's won numerous awards, including the George Polk Award for Metropolitan Reporting and a Pulitzer Prize for commentary. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jimmy Breslin.
Supposed to talk. My thing that I was thinking about coming up here today was I was working as a reporter. I don't know how old I was, 16 and a half, 17, at the Long Island Press newspaper. And I came from the neighborhood, 134th Street. And they had the executioner in New York State. They did the full fiction, let the guy go into the sky. That's his rule. But he didn't have that many guys every week to blow away. He had to do anything, so he had to go house to house at the red light trouble. He was an electrician. My grandmother always called. We lived on the corner, and he lived a block and a half up, the executioner. He came down, big tall guy with a beard. He came down and he went in the cellar and he fixed the lights. From there, he came upstairs and got in his car, and he drove to Ossining, where he went in and had a big dinner, big boost up there. They all got stewed, and they walked over to the prison, and he went to the room there, and where they had an affair, a place to put people. They were going to turn it. So they had the guy in the chair, and the electrician went into the room. He was stewed. They must have pulled the wrong switch, because there was sparks and noise in the death chamber, and the big guy looked like the big guy they were taking, Boo Boo he was called. He was supposed to be gone, and he was gone. He was knocked out, so he was on the floor, and they touched him, and they jumped up and down, the guards, because that meant they got $150 per execution. That was a lot of money then. And you also had the thrill of getting paid, and then blowing the guy up. That ain't fair. If you let the guy go home and you have $150, that's all right, but it's not the real thing. You had to have the guy there, take care of him. So here they had the guy on the floor, and they were all testing his heart, and it was perfect. The executioner from Richmond Hill was out on the front steps of the Ossining, and they ran out yelling at him that the guy is still alive. That's what his heart. So he turned around, whoa, and ran back inside and said, "Let me get at that board," with the pull-outs. And they threw Boo Boo into the chair again, strapped him in, and gave a yell, and he went and hit him with a thing that sent the guy up to the roof. And that was it. He earned his $150 and went back to Richmond Hill, where the first thing he would do, and my grandmother would conjure up some problem, he would go down in the basement and fix it, electricity. And then he would do neighborhood lights and wait for the phone to ring to say that there's somebody in Sing Sing, which handled people from all over. They were lodged in Sing Sing, ready to get electrocuted, and they called him and he'd go and electrocute. And it was very good. I was too young to write for the newspaper, to write about it, but if the guy would have waited a couple of years, I would have been old enough to go and watch it. And everybody told me it was some sight to see that guy swaying against the straps. And when the Jews hit him, people actually, there were no deals over the election execution. The ones that really didn't cry were the widows. There was no tears from them at all when that bunch she's married to was sent away. She could handle that mess. And it made her a heroine for the day. She was outside the gate at Sing Sing when her husband was sent off. And that was the start of my being in the newspaper business. Yearning to get inside to watch it. I was too young. So I waited and waited, and by the time I was old enough to go in and watch, I lost the zest for the murder watching it. So I didn't want to go. And at the candy store on Liberty Avenue, two guys went in to hold it up. And there was a cop having a cup of coffee, and he shot one, and they shot back and killed him. And I was there, and they put my name on the paper that I had something to do with it. And I found the gun, and I was one of the shooters. They were looking to get the police who did the shooting out of the case. And I was perfect. 15, 16-year-old kid. And I was good. I shot two guys, and I was very good. It made me feel. So I had my name on the list that I was the shooter. And somebody in the state corrections department read the piece and saw that I signed it. And he took another look at the language, and he said, this kid didn't write this thing. He didn't say that. He wouldn't know what he's talking about. The wrong chair or something like that. She came through my confession to murdering one of the two guys out. I had to go, I could go and watch it, they told me, when they executed it. But that was all. Because my name was there. So I didn't see that one either. The way it went then, in all that time, and all that crime, which I made my living writing about the crime in New York. And then I started to be traveling for it. I regarded that stuff, but they always, my name was off. I was allowed to arrest the people, but not to put them in the electric chair. So in other words, I was getting robbed out of the real pleasure. Bringing them up to the desk with the handcuffs on. Desk sergeant signed them in, murder suspects, and I had to stand there. There was a precinct over here, was the precinct for the city then. It's over here. I worked at the Long Island Press. I know the precinct was right over here, and that was where they would take them on a murder charge. I always went over there, and then I could go across the street to the candy store from the police Queens headquarters. And the candy store was the owner, and he didn't care. If you wanted cigarettes, he had no time. Only horse pets. It was a bookmaker.
JB, you haven't even mentioned the bar this whole time.
The bar on the corner at 100.
That's where you go, right?
Yeah, the bar. Always the bar. What else am I going to tell you? That's all I did. Run around.
Our next honoree, Craig Carter, has been the editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair since 1992. Under his editorship, it has won 11 National Magazine Awards, including 2 for general excellence for magazines with a circulation of more than 1 million, the industry's top honor. Previously, he edited the New York Observer and co-founded and co-edited Spy magazine. He is also an Emmy and Peabody Award winning producer of documentaries. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Raven Carter.
Thank you so much. A while ago, I wrote a magazine article about a very brave World War I aerial photographer. And then editor Knopf saw it and asked if I would turn it into a book. And so I signed a contract with them. And I went to work on the book. And Amy Bell, who's sitting at the table, worked on it with me as my researcher. And that was 26 years ago. And I have yet to turn in the manuscript. I'm the least worthy person who's going to get this. But I'm really flattered by it, and doubly so by the great other people who have been with us today, and I feel very honored to be in the company. Thank you.
The next honoree, Bob Herber, had an 18-year career as an author for the New York Times, writing about politics, urban affairs, and social trends in the twice-weekly column. Prior to joining the Times, in 1993, he worked in both broadcast and print as national correspondent for NBC News and reporter for the Daily News. He is a distinguished senior fellow with Demos, a public policy organization. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bob Herber.
Well, you're always supposed to say it's a great honor, but this really is a great honor, and anyone who doesn't believe it, just look at the list of names, both on today's program and the history of the Deadline Club. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. You get older and people say, where did the years go? I'm getting so old that I'm starting to say, where did the decades go? I went to the Daily News in 1976, and it's hard to believe now, but when you went to that paper, I came from the Starlet in New Jersey, when you went to that paper, it was like walking onto the set of the front page in those days. I mean, there were guys in the newsroom who still wore hats. There was a guy that came around and would give shoe shines right in the newsroom. The news, this was in that old Daily News building on 42nd Street, where they shot some of the scenes for the Superman movies. The newsroom was on the 7th floor. On the 6th floor were the printers, which nobody knows what printers are anymore. But also on the 6th floor were the bookies. So all you had to do was go down one flight of stairs, and you could bet on whatever you wanted to. So they paid you in cash in those days. So every Friday, a guy would come around with a wheeled table with all these little brown envelopes that had your pay in it, had your name on it. And those were the days, obviously, before computers, so they had a spike. Kids don't know what a spike is either, but 6 or 8 inches tall, and you would just spike the dupe of your newspaper story on it so that the editors, if they lost the original, could come back and get it. So when they handed out the pay envelopes, somebody would take a spike and put it on a desk, and everybody would take a $20 bill and spike it on the bill so you had a stack of $20 bills. And then somebody would come with some dice, and you'd roll the dice. And whoever had the high number won all the 20s that were around. Two very quick stories. They had the legmen in those days, and I was a rewrite man, and the legmen never wrote their stories, and it was this famed police reporter. And so I was new to the Daily News. I had the headset on, I'm listening to this guy, and he's telling me about a murder down in Greenwich Village, and he's going, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this in my life. He said, she was young, she was beautiful, she was blonde, she was, so I'm thinking, so I said, well, how do you know, all this stuff? They said, how do you know she was blonde? I said, the cops tell you that? He said, nah, they're all blonde. then the final thing was how I finally got started on a decent career in New York, because I got recruited by the Daily News. So I was pretty full of myself. I had been, pretty much a star at the Star-Ledger, so I figured, why wouldn't I get recruited by the Daily News? I thought of myself as sort of like a high draft choice coming into the NFL. And it was not like that at all. I came to the Daily News. It was a big staff. It was a very small news hole. There was a lot of experience on that staff, and nobody cared about Bob Herbert from the New York Star-Ledger. So I couldn't even get any stories. I couldn't get into the paper. I'd go up to the city editor and I'd say, I'm up, meaning, I don't have anything to do, and he would say, I know, and then just go sit down. My great break came, believe it or not, in this weird way. The Daily News didn't do a lot of out-of-town stories in those days, but there was a big murder. They did do a lot of murder stories. There was this big murder where this guy killed his wife and then ran off with his mistress to Kenosha, Wisconsin, of all places. And this was like a big corporate guy, and Daily News was hot for this story. They were all over it. So they needed to send somebody out to Kenosha to cover the story, because the cops thought that that's where they were. Well, the problem was, in those days, when a reporter went out of town at the Daily News, you'd have to give them a cash advance. They didn't have credit cards. So you'd have to give them a cash advance. You'd have to go down to the basement, sign a lot of papers, blah, blah, blah. And it was a real nuisance. It was a pain in the neck for the editors. So I'm sitting there with nothing to do, as usual, and the city editor calls me up and he says, hey, Herbert, do you have a credit card? I had no idea what he's talking about. I didn't know that. I mean, I know what the credit card was. I didn't know why he was asking me. So I go, yeah, I have an American Express card. He goes, all right, you're going to Wisconsin. And because I had an American Express card, I got that assignment, and it was a big story for the Daily News, like a lead story in the paper day after day. I went out to Kenosha. They did, in fact, catch this guy and his mistress, and I'm calling in these stories, and I did a good job on the story. When I came back, I then became the guy that would do all the big out-of-town stories for the Daily News. And because I had an American Express card, my career was really ascent. Thank you very much.
Our next honoree, Carol Loomis, now a senior editor-at-large at Fortune magazine, has been on the masthead for an extraordinary 59 years. She is widely known for her profiles of financial titans such as Sandy Weil, Robert Rubin, and Warren Buffett, and edited the Buffett book, Tap Dancing Jim. Carol has received several Lifetime Achievement Awards, including the Gerald M. Loeb Lifetime Achievement Award and the Women's Economic Roundtable Award. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Carol Loomis.
Well, as my editors know, I'm sort of literal. So I read the instructions, and they said I was to talk briefly about what inspired my career. I'm not sure I've ever been asked that precise question before. So it sent me to recollecting, and I will mention some milestones that might be relevant. First, I had a grandfather who wrote a bad novel about renegade gangs in the Ozarks of Missouri. As a kid, I was an early reader, and I think I may have conquered that book's first paragraph before kindergarten. Perhaps it inspired me to think I could write. In any case, on my 10th Christmas, I gave my parents a handwritten 20-page, 11.5 by, what is that measurement we talk about? Whatever that is, 8.5 by 11 booklet with a fabulous cover line. Subjects of interest. An example of those subjects was the Declaration of Independence. I think this might have been my first try at long-form journalism. Being a Missourian myself, I inevitably made my way to the University of Missouri's well-known journalism school, a genre that Henry Luce once said can't spoil a good kid. Perhaps that's why I graduated in 1951, wanting to work for either Time or Life. I settled instead for a job editing a house organ for the Maytag Company. But while at Maytag, I had the inspiringly good fortune, good luck, to date a young man who loved reading Fortune. Naturally, I began reading Fortune too. And when I visited New York 2 years later looking for a job, I had expanded my wish list to Time, Life, and Fortune. I had interviews at all three, and only Fortune liked me. Thus were my next 60 years scripted. When I got to Fortune at age 24, everything about it was inspiring. The managing editor, Hedley Donovan, was clearly a genius, and each one of the writers I worked with, naturally they were all men, these writers were only minutely lower on the genius scale. What's more, these paragons were ready to teach me all I wanted to know, and there was almost no end to that. It began to dawn on me that I was born to work on a business magazine. Indeed, specifically this one with its remarkable collegial staff and format. Since I began to write at Fortune, we're getting down to truth now, 8 years after I joined it, I will confess that almost all my inspiration has come from one emotion: fear. Fear that I can't thoroughly understand my subject. Fear that I can't explain it to the reader. And terrible dread of the moment when I will finally be exposed as a fraud. So think sympathetically of me, please, as I return to my office after this wonderful lunch and am again transported into a state of fear. Thank you very much for your time.
Our next honoree, Linda Mason, became the first woman to work as a producer for the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite in 1971. She went on to hold many high-ranking positions at CBS News, including executive producer of two of the network's iconic broadcasts, Sunday Morning with Charles Kuralt and CBS Reports. Linda became the Senior Vice President for Standards and Special Projects before retiring earlier this year. She's won numerous awards, including 13 Emmys, 2 DuPont Awards, a Peabody Award, and a George Book Award. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Linda Mason.
Well, this indeed is a great surprise and an honor, because most of the names we all know, and I'm kind of behind the scenes, really behind the scenes, but thank you very, very much. I was asked how I got started as a journalist, why I was interested. Began my junior year in high school when I was elected editor of the high school paper. I went to get a job at my local newspaper to learn newspapering. And I arrived at the Middletown, New York Record, and I was assigned to work on the women's pages. That meant I rewrote engagements and weddings, and I kept the calendar. Very important. Under the watchful eye of an older woman who had been editor of the page forever. Journalism came really alive for me 2 weeks, when she took a 2-week vacation, and a man filled in. He put wine in the pages, wow, wine recipes. And he sent me out on my first assignment. It was an interview with the Salvation Army in Middletown, New York, and it was fascinating, the stories that they told. I had no idea what the Salvation Army did. I went home and I wrote and I rewrote and I rewrote, and I practically wore my typewriter ribbon out. And finally I handed it in, and I was scared stiff, and the editor took it and ran it through his typewriter, and it came out with my byline. I was hooked. I continued working at the Record while I was in school at Brown. My mother used to drive me to the interviews. I didn't have a license yet. By then, a new woman's editor had come to the Record, and she was fresh from Columbia J School, and she started a style section. And there was lots of reporting to do. The city manager of Newburgh, New York, had begun a hunt for welfare cheats. This little town, about half an hour from Middletown, became a national story. All the national press was there. The editor sent me to find out about the welfare chiselers. The recipients I met could not have lived without the payments. A blind older man, a woman with 3 children, no job, no husband. I wrote the stories and hoped to have readers understand that there was a need for these payments. While at Brown, I was a stringer for the Providence Journal, and one summer an intern. Over a weekend, I participated in a freedom ride and witnessed the incredible hatred as we tried to integrate a restaurant in Glenbury, Maryland, a suburb of Baltimore. I wanted to share the experience, so I wrote a piece for the Journal. That paper had been a path to the New York Times, and I dreamed of being a Timesman. That all changed my senior year, when 50 years ago this month, JFK was assassinated. I saw the power of television news and knew this was my future. Viewers could react immediately to the reporting, and I knew I wanted to report stories in this medium. My thesis professor was chagrined. TV news? Miss Mason. I like to write, I love to meet people and hear their stories, and I liked investigative reporting. There was some internal force that kept pushing me to cover the news, and now to do it for television. At CBS News, I co-produced a 3-part series on the Great Grain Robbery. We showed how 6 grain companies were able to manipulate a government subsidy to the tune of tens of millions of dollars of taxpayers' expense. The first part ran almost 12 minutes on the evening news, unheard of. And Congress moved to correct the situation. I was learning that TV news could make a difference. During the 70s oil embargo, I produced a 5-part, 40-minute series on energy for the Cronkite News. After reading 50 articles claiming that the United States was running out of energy, I read the 51st. And it said there would always be plenty of energy as long as we could pay for it. I learned that oil, natural gas, coal, and nuclear power were all controlled by the oil companies. And they had excellent lobbyists who contributed heavily to congressional campaigns. Of course, we all know this today, but in those days, it was news. As my career at CBS News advanced and I became vice president executive producer of CBS Reports, I was able to revisit some of the stories that have been the soundtrack of my generation. I went to Vietnam with General Norman Schwarzkopf. I went to Cuba with Dan Rather to interview Fidel. We did an hour investigating the Kennedy assassination, and we did an hour on my hero, Edward R. Murrow, and the McCarthy hearings, to name a few. I don't know why, but in those days, it wasn't easy being green, meaning broadcast journalism was a man's profession. And there were all kinds of incidents that peppered my career, but one of the most egregious was I had been working at the morning news, I was a writer, and I was producing stories. And 2 years later, I felt I was a real producer. And an opportunity appeared, somebody was leaving, and I went to the executive producer and I said, I'd like to take that job as a producer. And he said, women cannot be producers. I was so floored, I just said nothing. I continued to work, and several months later, he made me a producer. And the evening news scooped me up soon thereafter to be their first woman producer. At the same time, they hired an African-American reporter, and I used to joke that Roger and I are your 2 minorities, and they never contradicted me. Of course, there were many men who helped me in my career, helped me realize my dream, and I thank them all. And in return, I've tried to help others as they come along and reach out for their dream. And I've tried to be there for them and help them find it. But again, thank you very, very much.
Our next honoree, Bill Moyers, is in his 42nd year with PBS, where he's won over 35 Emmys for a wide range of programs, from investigative reports such as The Secret Government, The War and Trade Secrets, to memorable series such as Now with Bill Moyers, A Walk Through the 20th Century, and Joseph Campbell, The Power of Men. Bill also served as chief correspondent for the documentary series CBS Reports and as senior news analyst for the CBS Evening News. He retired in 2000, only to return with the weekly Moyers and Company program in 2012. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bill Moyers.
In this company, I still feel like a cub reporter. I just received an email, seriously, from my senior writer, Michael Winship, who's president, as some of you know, of Writers Guild East. This is a true story. The Patriot Union in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, just this morning retracted its 1863 editorial calling the Gettysburg Address silly. We journalists can change our minds. I was 16 years old when I started as a cub reporter on the Marshall News Messenger in the small East Texas town where I grew up. It was a good place to be a cub reporter, small enough to navigate and big enough to keep me busy and learning something every day. Covering City Hall, courthouse, the school board. The school board first wouldn't let me in because they said a student can't cover the school board. High school sports journalism became for me a continuing course in adult education, my own. And I learned very quickly from local sources that news is what people want to keep hidden, everything else is publicity. I soon had a stroke of very good luck. Some of the old timers were on vacation or out sick, and I got assigned to help what came to be known nationally as the Housewives Rebellion. 15 white women, we were 10,000 blacks, 10,000 whites in Marshall, Texas. Then it was the home of Wiley College, which became the great debating team that took on USC, and in the movie took on Harvard. But it was a great place to be, but utterly segregated, one side of the tracks and the other side of the tracks. And these 15 white women in town decided not to pay the Social Security withholding for their domestic workers, all of whom were black. They argued that Social Security was unconstitutional, that imposing it would be taxation without representation. And here's my favorite part, which I got in an interview with one of them. Requiring us to collect the tax is no different from requiring us to collect the garbage. They actually said that. They hired themselves a lawyer, the infamous Martin Dias Jr., former congressman, best known or worst known for his work as head of the House Committee on Un-American Activities in the 30s and 40s. Yes, even then the Tea Party had antecedents in Texas. So the housewives went to court, and eventually they held their noses and paid the taxes. The stories that we wrote collectively for the newspaper were picked up by the Associated Press. And one day Spencer Jones, the managing editor, called me over, pointed to the AP ticker beside his desk, and moving across the ticker was a note citing one Bill Moyers for his reporting on the Housewives Rebellion. Well, to use the other term somebody's already used, I was hooked. And in one way or another, I've been covering the class war ever since. Those women in my hometown were its advance guard. They were regulars at church. Their children were my friends. Many were active in community affairs. Their husbands were pillars of the business and professional class in town. They were respectable and upstanding citizens, so much so that it took me a while to figure out what had brought on that spasm of reactionary rebellion. And it came to me one day, much later. They simply couldn't see beyond the veil of their own prerogatives. Fiercely loyal to their own kind, they narrowly defined membership in democracy to include only people like them. The women from the other side of the tracks who washed and ironed their laundry, made their beds, cleaned their bathrooms, swept their floors, and cooked their families' meals. These women, too, would grow old one day, sick and decrepit. They too would lose their husbands and face the ravages of time. They would have nothing to show for what they had done, their years of labor, but the creases on their brow and the knots on their knees and their knuckles. But those white housewives refused to think of them as part of the deal. That was the beginning of my education as a journalist. I moved on to work my way through the University of Texas by working 40 hours a week for KTBC Radio and TV. We were the first television station in Texas to go mobile. With a station wagon we painted red and called what else Red Rover, so that I could wheel around town in style, broadcasting from crime scenes and accidents and the state legislature, which I discovered was the biggest crime scene in town. That was the second phase of my education. After that, I kept moving. My path led me to graduate school, including seminary, and then for 7 years to Washington politics and government, and then to Newsday as publisher for a few years. And from there, through circumstances so convoluted, I still don't understand them all these while. Years later, I came to television, to broadcasting. It took me a while after I left Washington, and I'd served 3 years as LBJ's press secretary, as some of you know. It took me a while after I left Washington to get my footing back in journalism. I had to learn all over again that what's important for the journalist is not how close you are to power, but how close you get to the truth. Having been on both sides, I can tell you that trying to tell the truth about people whose job it is to hide the truth is almost as complicated and difficult as it is trying to hide it in the first place. Unless you're willing to go fight, to fight and refight the same battles until you go blue in the face, drive the people you work with nuts, going over every last detail to make sure you get it right, and then take hit after hit from Fox News and Rush Limbaugh accusing you of bias or even a point of view. There's no use trying unless you love it, and I do. And I thank all my colleagues who have helped me as a journalist. I thank all of you I've worked with before, and I thank all of you today for giving me this chance to say thank you.
Has very recently returned to Time Inc., where he served as the editor-in-chief from 1995 to 2005. His new title will be Chief Content Officer. From 2008 to 2013, he held the same title at Bloomberg. His career began at the Wall Street Journal, where he worked for 23 years, 9 of those as managing editor and then executive editor. He has been inducted into the American Society Magazine Editors Hall of Fame. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Norman Pearlstein.
What an extraordinary pleasure to be in Sardis in this room to get this honor with this group. And I can't think of anything greater than following Bill Moyers, because he is someone who has been just such a great teacher to me throughout my life. So Bill, thank you. It's just wonderful listening to you, as well as everyone else. Like Linda Mason, I thought that television was my future, and in the mid-1960s, as a second-year student at Penn Law School, I managed to get an interview with Fred Friendly for a summer internship. Came up to New York in February of 1966 for a 10 a.m. appointment, and as I was sitting out in the lobby over on West 57th Street, I saw Fred Friendly walking out with his hat on his head and a briefcase. And I sort of looked at that and I didn't know what to do. I sat for a while, and about 10:15 I walked up to the receptionist and I said, but is Mr. Friendly coming back? And she said, no, actually he is gone. And I said, well, for the day? And she said, no, he's gone. And I said, well, I'm here for an interview with him for a summer internship. And they said, well, we don't really quite know what to do with you, but there's a guy running the desk back there named Ralph Passman. And why don't you go see him? And I went back and looked at Ralph Passman. He said, what are you doing here? I said, I'm here to see Fred Friendly. And he said, he's gone. I don't need any law students here. Why don't you go back to where you belong in Philadelphia? Passman had worked for the Philadelphia Daily News. I learned subsequently and hated it. And that was his ultimate insult. So a year later, I finished law school, and I decided that I still was interested in New York, and I took a job as a copy boy at the New York Times, where I, among other things, met Sam Solowitz, who was head of the Copy Boys, and who also thought I belonged in Philadelphia. And I was really a pretty bad copy boy. I was about to get fired, and fortunately, I had two things happen. One was I had developed a friendship with the city editor of the New York Post, a guy named Johnny Bott, who a couple of you may remember. And Johnny, he taught me a couple things. One, he would say, he taught me what a double-double-double was, because that's what he drank at the Oyster Bar every night before catching his train out to the suburbs. Second thing he said to me was, he said, opinions are like assholes, everybody has one. And he would utter that every night as he would throw down, which convinced me not to be an editorial writer. But I was really lobbying him hard, because the only job I had on the horizon was taking a job as the Wall Street Journal cub reporter in Dallas, Texas. And he had an opening for a law reporter. Sid Zion had gone to the New York Times about a year before, and they'd never quite filled it. And I kept saying, Johnny, why don't you hire me as law reporter? He said, no. He said, go to Texas. Get the hell out of New York. You don't belong here. The only time I ever got to Sardi's was to carry a late edition of the Daily News into the editors who had left the desk and were magically here somehow while still employed. But I followed Johnny Bott's advice. I went to Texas. I was given the cotton beat, which meant that I covered Memphis, which meant that I covered a garbage strike in April of 1968, managed to cover the Martin Luther King assassination, and from that time on have had great bosses, great stories, and just a great life. Special thanks to Warren Phillips and Peter Kahn of the Wall Street Journal, who were news executives who knew the importance of playing it straight and always did. To Jim Michaels, the smartest editor I ever worked for, whose widow Jean Briggs is here today. The 2 years with Forbes really were a part of the education of a lifetime. To Jerry Levin, who as CEO of Time Warner was as committed to free speech and independence of journalism as any CEO who wasn't a journalist that I've ever met. And to Walter Isaacson, John Huey, and Martha Nelson, who taught me more about how magazines and newspapers are different and the importance of magazines and the enduring legacy that has served me well ever since. And to Dan Doctoroff and Matt Winkler at Bloomberg News, who let me do all kinds of crazy things for 5.5 years, including just last month, going to Manila, where I managed to interview Imelda Marcos at age 84, and the first thing she said to me is, oh, you're from New York. Do you know Cindy Adams? I am afraid that I do not, but I'm going to see her next time. She said, will you please give her a big kiss for me? So, I don't know if your hairdresser will approve, but this is from Imelda. Thank you very much.
Well, you can't fault that. A kiss from Imelda Marcos, and